Hi everybody, hurry up to write your name in the chat, guys. Maria, how are you, pretty Maria? Thank you so much for your joining. Clara, how are you, dear Clara? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Clara. Romy, how are you, pretty Romy? Thank you so much for your joining. Boxing, how are you, Boxing? Thank you so much for your joining. Asaf, for you, dear Asaf, for you, Asaf. Thank you so much for your joining. Weston, how are you, dear Weston? How are you, Weston? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Weston. Amal, how are you, pretty Amal? How are you, Amal? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Amal. Please, guys, you should have to write your name in the chat. Aria, how are you, dear Aria? How are you, Aria? Thank you so much for your joining. Everybody to write your name in the chat, guys. Thank you so much for your joining. To send the laughing disco and do the super chat, guys. Ava, how are you, Ava? Dr. Dev, how are you, Dr. Dev? Thank you so much for your joining, Dr. Dev. How are you, dear Dev? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Dev. Mifia, how are you, Mifia? How are you, Mifia? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Mifia. Emery, how are you, dear Emery? How are you, Emery? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Emery. Leola, how are you, Leola? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Leola. Athens, how are you, dear Athens? How are you, Athens? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Athens. Malam, how are you, dear Malam? How are you, Malam? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Malam. Please, everybody, have to write your name in the chat, guys. Aisa, how are you, dear Aisa? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Aisa. Lee, how are you, dear Lee? How are you, Lee? Thank you so much for your joining. I'm fine. I'm good, my dear. Anili, hi Anili, how are you, Anili? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Anili. Thank you so much for your joining, dear Anili. Please, guys, send the laughing disco, do the super chat, guys. Michael, how are you, dear Michael? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Michael. Thank you, Jacob. How are you, dear Jacob? Thank you so much for joining, respected Jacob. Kale, how are you, dear Kale? How are you, Kale? Thank you so much for your joining. Haran, how are you, dear Haran? How are you, Haran? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Haran. Please, everybody, have to write your name in the chat, do the super chat, guys, and send the laughing disco. Mia, how are you, dear Mia? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Mia. How are you, Mia? Please, guys. Oh my god, thank you, Mac. Thank you so much, dear Mac. Thank you, Mac. How are you, dear Mac? Thank you, Mac. How are you? If you wanna send the laughing disco or fingers, yeah, you wanna send the laughing disco or fingers, I will be write your name on here. Gene words. Okay, dear. Genie. Wow, Jenny, wow. Thank you, Jenny, wow. Thank you so much, dear. Thank you. Thank you, dear. If you wanna send the laughing disco or fingers, I will be write your name on the board. Wafa, Wafa, how are you, dear Wafa? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Wafa. How are you, Wafa? Zani, how are you, pretty Zani? How are you, Zani? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Zani. Ariane, how are you, dear Ariane? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Ariane. How are you, Ariane? Everybody, write your name in the chat, guys. Larry, how are you, dear Larry? Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you, my dear. Thank you. Can you send a one finger hearts or laughing disco, my dear? If you want, can easily, you should have to send it. Harry, how are you, Harry? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Harry. Anna, how are you, dear Anna? How are you, Anna? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Anna. Oliver, how are you, dear Oliver? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Oliver. Please, everybody, have to write your name in the chat, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. Hurry up, guys. Farah, how are you, pretty Farah? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Farah. Everybody have to write your name in the chat, guys. Amelia, how are you, Amelia? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Amelia. Suslini, how are you, Swisslini, how are you, Swisslini? Thank you so much for your joining, dear. I have sub and like. Thank you so much for subscribing and liking, my dear. Yusana, how are you, Yusana, how are you, dear Yusana? Thank you so much. Aya, how are you, dear Aya? How are you, Aya? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Aya. Jack King, how are you, Jack? Jai Kyung, thank you so much for you joining, my dear. Thank you so much for you joining my sister. And Jackson, hi Jackson, how are you, Jackson? Thank you so much for your joining, Jackson. And Mirani, hi Mirani, how are you, Mirani? How are you, pretty Mirani? Everybody have to write your name in, guys. Anaya, how are you, dear Anaya? Thank you so much for you joining, pretty Anaya. Everybody send the finger hearts or laughing disco for the support, guys. Tayan, how are you, Tayan? Thank you so much for your joining, respecting Tayan. Anaya, I write your name, my dear. Alison, hi, dear Alison. How are you, Alison? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Alison. How are you, Alison? Ara, how are you, dear Ara? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Ara. Ali, how are you, dear Ali? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Ali. How are you, Ali? Please, everybody, have to write your name in the chat. Rayam, how are you, Rayam? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Rayam. Galberet, how are you, Galberet? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Galberto, how are you, Galberto? Thank you so much for your joining, my dear. Abdor, how are you, Abdor? How are you, Abdor? How are you, Abdor? Thank you so much for your joining. Leona, how are you, Leona? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Leona. Olivia, how are you, dear Olivia? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Olivia. How are you, Olivia? Everybody to write your name and send the laughing disco, guys. Gogu, how are you, Gogu? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Gogu. Olivia, I write your name, my dear. Thank you so much for your joining. Harrison, hi Harrison. Thank you so much for your joining. Amy, how are you, Amy? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Amy. Please, everybody, to write your name in the chat, send the laughing disco, or do the super chat, guys. Olena, holy Olena, thank you so much for your joining, respected Olena. Hurry up, guys. Chocolate, hi Chocolate, how are you, Chocolate? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Chocolate. Pagzi, how are you, dear Pagzi? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Pagzi. Please, everybody, to write your name in the chat, guys. Bia, how are you, pretty Bia? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Bia. Amelie, how are you, dear Amelie? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Amelie. Everybody, write your name in the chat, do the super chat for the support, guys, and send the laughing disco. Thank you so much for your joining, guys. Thank you. Welcome, dear Amelie. Amelie, if you wanna can do a super chat, you should do the super chat for my donation. If you can send a laughing disco, you should have to send a one laughing disco for the support, my dear. Thank you so much. Yeah, guys, everybody have to send the laughing disco and do the support, guys. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat. Holly, hi Holly, how are you, dear Holly? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Holly. Everybody to write your name in the chat. Harry, how are you, Harry? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Harry. Can you please, Taylor? Yeah, why not, dear Taylor? Hi Taylor, how are you, Taylor? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Taylor. No, how are you, dear? No, thank you so much for your joining, respected. No, Lena, hi Lena, how are you, dear Lena? I'm from Bangladesh. Oh, thank you. Can you please write? Yeah, why not? Nandani, how are you, Nandani? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Nandani. Everybody have to write your name in the chat. Hi Harry, how are you, Harry? Ayan, how are you, dear Ayan? Thank you so much for your joining. To send the laughing disco, I'll do the super chat, guys. Kayo, how are you, Kayo? Thank you so much for your joining. And Rudra, yeah, Rudra, how are you, Rudra? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Rudra. Susan, how are you, dear Susan? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Susan. Please, everybody, to write your name, send the laughing disco, or do the super chat, guys. Thank you so much for your joining. Hurry up, everybody. Hurry up to write your name, guys. Thank you so much. Welcome, dear Jale. How are you, Jale? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Jale. Leona, how are you, dear Leona? Thank you so much for your joining. Rome, how are you, dear Rome? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Rome. Sisin, how are you, dear Sisin? How are you, Sisin? Thank you so much for your joining. Please, everybody, to write your name in the chat, guys. Dennis, how are you, dear Lucifer, how are you, Lucifer? How are you, Lucifer? Thank you so much for your joining. Please, everybody, send the finger hearts as our laughing disco, guys. Dennis, how are you, dear Dennis? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Dennis. Jacob, how are you, dear Jacob? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Jacob. Hurry up, guys. Everybody to write your name in the chat, guys. Sora, how are you, dear Sora? Thank you so much for your joining. Mara, how are you, Mara? Thank you so much for your joining. Potato, how are you, Potato? Please, everybody, to write your name in the chat, guys. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Jennifer, how are you, Jennifer? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Jennifer. Rowan, hi Rowan, how are you, Rowan? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Rowan. Hurry up, guys. Kale, how are you, dear Kale? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Kale. Hurry up, guys. Everybody to write your name in the chat. Lole, how are you, Lole? Damla, how are you, Damla? Thank you so much for your joining. Abrela, how are you, Abrela? Thank you so much for your joining. Leslie, how are you, Leslie? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Leslie. Please, everybody, to write your name in the chat, guys. Mark, how are you, dear Mark? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Mark. Charleru, how are you, Charleru? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Charleru. Please, everybody, have to write your name in the chat, guys, and send the laughing disco or do the super chat, guys. Hurry up, guys. Leon, how are you, dear Leon? Thank you so much for your joining, respected Leon. Any person can send the loving disco. Kyle, I write your name earlier. Hi dear Harrison, how are you Harrison? Hi Abrela, how are you dear Abrela? How are you dear Abrela? Thank you so much for you joining there. Abrela, I write your name pretty.